Thanks to everyone who's here. My name is Roslyn Fuller, and I'm a political theorist, although my background is in international law. And in Germany, where I got my first degree, when you study law, it isn't officially called law, it's actually called legal science, which is appropriate because we go about it in a very science-based kind of way. And the focus is very much on applying logic, testing evidence, trying to isolate factors. It's a very sharp, unfuzzy way of thinking. And we do this for two reasons: to try to find out the truth and to apply a fair and coherent set of rules to what is often a really, really messy world. So if you want to be a good lawyer or a judge, if someone says something a bit odd or something doesn't stack up, you don't let it slide. You get to the bottom of it and you check if it really makes sense. And when I began focusing on democracy more, particularly when I was writing my PhD many years ago, I applied this really rigorous framework to political theory. And over the past few years, I've applied it to one claim in particular, and that is that people are so awful that politics, and democracy in particular, needs to be protected from them. The message is basically, you're stupid, you're lazy, and you're unworthy, so get out and let someone who knows what they're doing run the show. And this became really pronounced with the Brexit referendum and Trump election in 2016, the idea that democracy as we know it needs to stop because these people don't deserve it. And when you put something like that out there, you need to make up a justification for it. Why would it make sense to protect a form of government that literally means people power from people? What exactly would that mean, and why precisely would it be a good thing? What would be the benefits of that, and to whom would they accrue? So I investigated this very thoroughly, and in fact, I wrote a book and all kinds of articles on it, and I'll be sharing some of the results of that today. So first, I'm going to examine some of the myths that are supposed to prove people can't handle democracy, but they really don't stack up, not logically, not factually either. It's basically like myth busting for democracy. And then I'm going to look at the various suggestions out there, based, of course, on those myths, for fixing democracy by reducing people's power. And then finally, I'm going to explain how we can save ourselves the work of trying to exclude people who aren't the problem with democracy anyway, and change processes instead, which are. So the first myth I'm going to talk about is one I call Sharknado, after the B movie of the same name. Sharknado is famous in academic and journalism circles, and is one of the most quoted pieces of research that tries to show that people, meaning me and you, are not fit for democracy. The basic message of this myth is that people are so irrational that even something like a shark attack could make them change their vote. And if people are casting votes for such a dumb reason, it makes sense to question whether they're capable of exercising democracy at all. However, this myth, despite being repeated thousands of times and often exaggerated into the bargain, was based on nothing but thin air. This is the story of the research that went into Sharknado. 4 months prior to the re-election of Woodrow Wilson as president of the United States in 1916, there was a string of shark attacks off the coast of New Jersey. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it also much later inspired the movie Jaws. The shark in question even swam up a creek where you'd think he would be safe and killed 2 people there. Now, understandably, people started canceling their vacations to New Jersey. However, the situation didn't last too long because some locals killed the shark. So you'd think that'd be case closed. But in that popular beachfront area, not as many people voted for Woodrow Wilson in the 1916 election as the professors who conducted the celebrated research of Sharknado thought should have voted for him based on his 1912 vote. And they figured it was probably because of that shark and people's insane propensity to blame helpless Woodrow Wilson for it. However, like a guy claiming that his ex-girlfriends are all just crazy, there's a lot of red flags here. Flag number 1. There were some problems even with the statistics. The sample size was small because the population was small, and therefore a few people changing their vote could have a disproportionate impact on results. To make matters worse, despite being small, the population did grow rapidly between 1912 and 1916, changing by up to 25%. So comparing the two elections was like comparing apples to oranges. Something that was complicated even further by boundary changes between elections. In their eagerness to find vote change by shark, and thus proof of voter irrationality, the original researchers didn't give enough weight to these things. When two other political scientists studied every fatal shark attack in US history and compared them to elections between 1872 and 2012, a much larger and better controlled sample, they found no evidence that shark attacks affect elections. Voting patterns often changed to the degree they had in the beach counties of New Jersey, whether there was a shark attack or not. But it continues. Flag number 2. Wilson's 1916 vote share dropped by even greater percentages in other parts of New Jersey that were not affected by the shark attacks, as well as in other states. In fact, Wilson lost every state in the Northeastern and Great Lakes region. Wilson's performance in New Jersey was actually part of a broader Democratic strategy to rely on the solid South rather than Northern voters. The shark may have swum up a creek, but it didn't get over Niagara Falls, and it couldn't have affected voters in Wisconsin and Illinois very much. This is all quite conclusive already, but the third and final flag was probably the biggest one of all. President Wilson, who was a Democrat, performed unusually well in New Jersey in 1912 for very good reason. For one thing, he had been governor of New Jersey, and voters tend to vote for candidates from the local area. But he also excelled because Republicans did so much of the work for him. In the 1912 election, former Republican President Theodore Roosevelt ran a highly successful third-party campaign that split the Republican vote. In fact, this campaign by Roosevelt was famous, and Roosevelt's split became known as the Bull Moose Party because Roosevelt said he felt as strong as a bull moose and later proved it by getting shot in the chest and just going ahead and delivering a 90-minute speech anyway. That is hard to beat. And perhaps, unsurprisingly, Roosevelt outpolled the actual Republican candidate and sitting president William Taft in 1912. Wilson was dealing with an opposition that was determined to take itself out. But by 1916, the Republicans were back together again. And to make matters worse, their candidate was former New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes, based right next door. Between 1896 and 1932, New Jersey voted Republican in every presidential election, except 1912, when the Democratic candidate was their former governor and the Republican Party was deeply split. So the election variation probably had more to do with that than the shark attack. The only thing crazy about this, which is based on wild conjecture about an election that happened 100 years ago, is how thin the evidence is, but how much it's lauded by the few people who would benefit if it were true and people were unworthy of their votes. So let's move on to myth number 2. According to this myth, many people's votes are merely constructs of their racism and sexism. This myth isn't just about proving that there is racism and sexism, which is pretty uncontentious. It's about saying that people don't really want the policies or politicians they vote for. They're just controlled by racist and sexist thoughts that override everything else. And maybe if people don't vote for any actual reasons, but merely to express their group identity, one person, one vote democracy doesn't make sense. The first person this was really used against was Bernie Sanders in the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries. In the 2016 primaries, Bernie Sanders polled 11 points worse among women than among men, and 18 points worse among non-whites than among whites. His opponents used this to claim that Sanders voters weren't voting for him because they liked his policies, but because he was a convenient vehicle for anti-Clinton sentiment, especially among white men and from really white Vermont. But if we look at the figures, votes for Sanders didn't really have much of a leaning towards any gender or ethnicity. What they did have was a very pronounced tilt towards younger voters. Young women were far more likely to vote for Sanders than Clinton, and young voters of color were more likely to approve of Sanders and vote for him too. The great divider of the 2060 Democratic primary race was not race or sex, it was age. Now, Donald Trump was no Bernie, and even his supporters didn't like him that much. About a year and a half after the election, a reporter went looking for Trump supporters, and here's what they had to say about him. Even before the election, non-college educated voters identified Trump's verbal treatment of women as his top negative point, with white supremacist support for Trump also making it into the top issues. In fact, in the exit polls, only 41% of Trump voters said that they strongly favored him. That is what they said immediately after casting their ballot, not 3 months later when disillusionment might have set in. Indeed, 11% of those who said Trump's treatment of women bothered them a lot still voted for him, while 73% of those who said it bothered them somewhat did. But among voters who rated a candidate's ability to bring change as the most important quality, 82% voted for Trump. Bernie voters wanted change, Trump voters wanted change, Obama voters wanted change. So Jewish socialist, white businessman, Black social organizer, who cares? Change, change, change. So while racism and sexism are undoubtedly issues in Western society, anti-Democrats fall far short of demonstrating that voters unthinkingly cast votes based on identity rather than policy, and that these votes should thus somehow be invalidated. And racism and sexism haven't gotten worse under democracy. The trend is definitely towards improvement. The more power elites have, the less they value other people's lives. History is really quite clear on this. There's been quite a lot of slavery, colonialism, literal witch hunts, and discrimination in the past. And if you don't believe me, listen to Billy Joel. He didn't get to be where he is by being unperceptive. If anything, the obvious correlation is that the more people have gotten involved in politics, the better things have become. Because they do think, and they can be reasoned with. Finally, anti-Democrats say that one person, one vote democracy doesn't work due to what's known as rational ignorance. This means that people don't bother to learn about politics because they realize that their vote is but one of meaningless millions, unlikely to decide the fate of an election. Now, this is another weird idea. In Douglas Adams' sci-fi classic, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's an obsessive inventor called Shrintragula. And because he's so obsessive, his wife continually pleads with him to try to get a sense of proportion. And because he absolutely doesn't have one, rather than just letting it go, he invents a machine called the total perspective vortex that forces people to perceive the universe and their place in it in accurate proportions. In other words, it forces them to recognize their true insignificance. When Mrs. Tragula is hooked up to the machine, the total perspective she's subjected to literally blows her mind, as it does to everyone else who ever steps into it. In fact, the total perspective vortex goes on to be used as an instrument of torture and execution for the rest of the books. As Douglas Adams himself said, if life was going to survive in a universe of this size, then the one thing it cannot afford to have is a sense of proportion. If people went around contemplating their own insignificance and the sheer futility of existence, they would not just fail to keep up with politics. They probably wouldn't eat or go to work either. But this democratic myth uses this as an explanation, not for major clinical depression, which would probably be more accurate, but for people not remembering little factoids, like who your local MP is, or what Mikhail Gorbachev looks like, or what GDP in the second quarter of 2017 was. People often can't answer these little trivia questions because, allegedly, They're too overwhelmed by the grim law of infinity, and they can't answer these trivial trivia. The idea goes, how can they possibly make good political decisions? But just like excursions into the total perspective vortex are rare, and thus can't explain these little memory lapses, people also don't make decisions by remembering little factoids and calculating correct answers like a computer. In fact, cognitive scientists figured this out because they've been trying to make artificial intelligence. And they realized that if you try to make a robot calculate its movements mathematically, it takes too much time and processing power. The reason people are able to react quickly is because they don't do things that way. Mainly, we just adjust to the environment on an ad hoc basis, like finding your way around by vaguely remembering landmarks rather than having a map inside your head. So, you might remember the name of your representative if you need to call them about something. Or you might remember, oh yeah, that's Mikhail Gorbachev, if late 1980s Russia is in the news again for some reason. But that's different than cold recall, which you have no incentive to do most of the time. Cold recall of unconnected factoids is something some people are better at than others. But overall, it's just not really how we process things. And that's fine, because while people may not be great at remembering bits of trivia, politics is about making more complex decisions, generally based quite firmly on real life experience. You don't need to know the exact number of nurses in the UK to know that there often isn't one available when you need one. You don't need to know what Yemen's 2019 GDP was to think, hey, maybe you don't want to blow people up there. Most people's policy preferences are both moderate and consistent. In other words, people score well on making concrete policy in the real world, even if they score poorly on trivia and abstract knowledge. By insisting on measuring people against a set of achievements that aren't actually relevant to the task at hand, anti-democrats are purposely setting them up for failure and then inventing odd justifications for why this discrepancy exists. So these myths all have something in common, and that is that they were invented to justify cutting people out of politics. And in fact, the people who tend to invent and spread these myths have a number of alternatives to one person, one vote democracy that they like to push. These are just some of the things that they want to do. Many of the people presenting these solutions believe that it would be best to strip most people of their voting rights. But unfortunately, they get too much pushback when they make suggestions like that, so they have to go for these kinds of half measures here instead. Many of them, however, also agree that the best short-term plan to get their way is something called sortition. And because there's such widespread agreement on this among anti-democrats, I'm going to talk more about it here, because it's probably the sneakiest idea there is out there to curtail participation. Sortition means making a selection by lottery. And sortitionists want to choose a very small number of people, usually between 50 and 500, to participate in what they call a citizens' assembly or citizens' jury. So these people are advised by carefully selected experts, and they themselves either advise existing elected governments, they act as a second chamber, for example, replacing the Senate or House of Lords, or in a rather extreme but very popular form, they replace the existing political system entirely. This ideology also relies on the rational ignorance argument we saw before, namely that people do not consider their own views, and therefore, due to their ignorance, they have incorrect ideas about what they think they want. Only the select few who attend a citizens' assembly, where they can be properly advised and informed, can make the right decisions. It's a very paternalistic attitude, and as with Sharknado, there are many red flags with sortition, and I will go into just a few of them here. The first flag with sortition is that it seeks to rely on a historical example of democracy, the Athenian model, but severely and intentionally mangles it. Under Athenian democracy, there were three major institutions: the Assembly, the Council of 500, and the courts. In addition, there were a number of office holders. These, the office holders, were mostly selected by lottery. But they didn't hold any power. Office holders back then weren't the same as office holders today. They carried out decisions from these people over here in the assembly. In the assembly, the body that debated and passed laws was not selected by lottery. Anyone could attend because Athenian democracy was based on equality. There were two ancillary bodies whose membership was selected by lottery: the Council of 500 and, only in the second half of Athenian democracy, the Nomothetai. The Council of 500 was composed of 500 randomly selected Athenians who did a whole bunch of things, but also organized the agenda for the assembly. However, this was a pretty loose agenda. Any individual citizen could wander by and put in a proposal for the agenda or make amendments to the council's generally vague proposals in the assembly. The Nomothetai, which were 1,000 people over the age of 30, and thus probably something like 1 out of every 30 people of that age, only came into existence late in Athenian democracy, when they decided to more strictly differentiate between decrees, which they passed all the time, and what they called laws, which they rarely used. The main job of the Nomothetai was to systematize the law and make sure that the more rare laws approved by assembly didn't contradict each other. There was no such thing as a law passed without any Athenian who wanted to having his say and his vote on it. If Athenian democracy was like what Sortitionists believe it was, it would have looked like this, except with way fewer people. The Athenian Democrats did not believe that people were too ignorant to make their own decisions, because that's an idea diametrically opposed to the logic of democracy. If they had believed that, they would have made things simple for themselves and had a king like everyone else. Unlike Sortitionists or citizen assembly advocates, the Athenians made huge efforts to have the greatest number of people possible participating in politics, even though that was much harder to achieve back then. Today, advocates want citizens' assemblies composed of a few hundred people, which is approximately 0.001% of the eligible voting population. By comparison, Athens had about 1/4 of the eligible population participating every single day. About 15 to 20% of the voting population participated in assembly, which happened 4 times a month, even though most people had to walk to get there. If we transpose this to modern states, we would be talking tens of millions of people participating daily. Citizen assembly advocates often like to run around telling people, it could be you, just like lotto ticket ads do. And just like gambling does, this preys on the vulnerable, taking what is theirs in reality in exchange for a slim chance at a fantasy. We already have equal political rights. We're born with them. You don't need to be chosen. And that's a good thing, because your chance of being chosen to participate in a citizens' assembly is, just like your chance of winning a large lotto prize, practically non-existent. Something like between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 100,000 over the course of your entire life. That's comparable to your chance of being killed by lightning in some countries. That's a fatal lightning strike. Your chance of just being hit by lightning is actually much higher than that. So under a citizens' assembly regime, you would go through life from the cradle to the grave with no self-determination at all. And to Sortitionists, that's good. Because remember, they believe those myths we laid out above, which means you're ignorant and you don't think things through. So why should you have the right to decide how you want to be involved in politics? But that's not the only reason citizen assemblies aren't a great idea. No body as small as a citizens' assembly can accurately reflect public opinion. Polling companies phone thousands of people to try to determine anything at all, and they usually have a margin of error, usually around 3% or so. If they could select a few hundred people and deliver completely accurate outcomes, they would. In an assembly of 500 people in the UK, each member would theoretically represent 100,000 other voters. Right now, a British MP represents on average 77,000 voters, 23% less. That's a very big issue for tight decisions, and tight decisions occur all of the time. In 1995, with 93% turnout, the province of Quebec rejected a referendum to separate from the rest of Canada by 50.58%, about 55,000 votes. The Irish referendum, legalizing divorce in 1995, was passed by 50.3%, a margin of only 9,000 votes. In the same country, the exclusion of suicidality as a grounds for abortion was rejected by 50.4% in 2002, and the abolition of the Seanad, the upper house, was rejected by 51.7% in 2013. I wanted to show these figures as a pie chart, but it doesn't work because the numbers are too close for you to be able to perceive the difference. So in a body of 500 people, 50%, a losing vote, is 250 people, and 50.58%, a winning vote, is 252.9 people. So if 2 or 3 people acting in a citizens' assembly were to change their minds on, e.g., the separation of Quebec from Canada, this would mean that 2 to 3 people would decide the fate of the nation. That's not going to fly even in a peaceful country like Canada. In fact, a lot of people promoting citizens' assemblies were unwilling to accept the Brexit referendum. Some of them even argued to use citizens' assemblies to overturn the referendum, despite the fact that it was decided by 1.3 million votes, and everyone had the chance to cast a ballot. So how would they expect others to accept a citizens' assembly of 50 people, in which the vast majority of citizens were not allowed to participate, and in which a swing from 51.9% in favor, the percentage of Leave voters in Brexit, to below 50%, could be achieved by one voter changing their minds? Do they expect that people will say, if only I weren't so ignorant and stupid, I guess I would have decided what you wanted me to decide? That is not the dynamic of empowered democracy. It is the dynamic of a highly abusive relationship. Finally, citizens' assemblies would be easily corrupted. When contemplating the ills of our current form of democracy, Sortitionists read the sentence, "A small number of people, selected by election, hold power," and translate that as selected by election. They zero in on what is actually the subordinate clause and identify the way that small number of people is chosen as the problem. If only people weren't chosen by election. But really, the main body of the sentence reads, a small number of people hold power. As long as you have a small number of people making important decisions, you'll have corruption, because corruption is economically and logistically feasible when the number of decision makers is low compared to the resources available in a society. In fact, under the system that sortitionists have concocted, corruption would possibly be worse than it is today. Citizen assembly advocates often argue that because they're just chosen out of the blue and can't get reelected, randomly selected members are not prone to self-enrichment and would not act for anything but the common long-term good. Now, that is a laugh riot. Just because people aren't literally too crazy or too stupid to cast a vote doesn't mean they're angels. There's a lot of space between those two concepts. While a randomly selected person may have nothing to gain politically from taking a bribe, they still have much to gain personally. And unlike politicians seeking re-election, nothing to lose politically. The equation in favor of corruption is, in other words, even more lopsided than it is for politicians. And to add fuel to the fire, unlike national politicians, many ordinary people have financial problems. People also do all kinds of immoral or illegal things, especially drugs, affairs, cheating on their taxes, and lying to their boss. There are plenty of people who are domestic abusers and petty crooks and bullies. It would likely be more effective to blackmail rather than to bribe these people, because, again, unlike politicians, they haven't bargained on having their cocaine use, gambling addiction, tax evasion, or love affair from 10 years ago being made public, especially to their boss or their loved ones. And since participant numbers are very low, the incentive to engage in these activities is very high. there are only two things that determine whether corruption will occur: how big is the incentive to engage in it, and what are the chances of getting caught. Rather than reduce the incentive and increase the chances of getting caught, sortition does the exact opposite. Sortition does not achieve higher levels of participation, better representation, or reduce corruption. Instead, sortition significantly cuts down on most people's freedom to participate in politics, and as it requires everyone to passively await selection to participate for several lifetimes, if that's what it takes. There's a reason it's endorsed by so many people who want to reduce the political power of the population in general, because they believe in these negative myths about people. But as we saw earlier, people aren't actually ignorant and stupid. So there's no reason to reduce their role in politics. Taking people out of democracy or reducing their impact, making democracy safe, and one has to ask, safe for whom, isn't aimed at improving democracy. It's aimed at annihilating it. The rich aren't getting richer and the poor aren't getting poorer because people have too much power. The very fact that that is even possible indicates that they don't have enough. People are not the problem. The problem is the process, and processes are comparatively easy to fix. There are a lot of movements and practices out there today that already use democratic processes that narrow the gap between input and output, ensuring that those pretty common sense ideas get reflected in policy. Today, I'd like to focus on online democracy. This isn't some kind of future cyber utopian idea. It's something that's happening right now. In fact, the Five-Star Movement, which has been a major player in Italian politics for several years and is currently on its third coalition in the national government, uses an online democracy platform called Rousseau. That platform allows members to decide on its policy, to select its candidates, to agree to every single coalition, and to put forward laws to go to parliament. You may never have heard of the Five-Star Movement or have heard very little about it. And that's quite amazing, because Italy is the 8th largest economy in the world and 4th most popular tourist destination. When you go to Florence or Venice or Sicily, these are the people regulating your stay. You're in a country that's partly run over this online platform, and it hasn't descended into anarchic chaos. Unlike, say, the US, which relies heavily on carefully vetted political advisory offices and largely excludes its people from decision-making. The Five-Star Movement is far from the only factor in Italian politics. There are a lot of other major political movements, and the European Union also has considerable influence. But it clearly shows one thing: having large numbers of people, and at this stage, we're already talking hundreds of thousands here, involved in politics over the internet, is no big deal. And that's because of the way Rousseau and many other widely used platforms out there is constructed. People, generally speaking, are not hopeless and stupid. However, if you build a system that incentivizes poor behavior, no matter how fractional the number of people who behave that way is, they will benefit and eventually dominate that system. So online democracy platforms are constructed in a way that simply refrains from rewarding that behavior, keeping what are small problems small. And they do this in several very simple ways. Direct participation, whether it be through referendums, participatory budgeting, or online democracy, is focused on decisions. Talking facilitates those decisions, but it's not a goal unto itself. By contrast, most so-called political participation today, outside of casting a ballot in elections, is just a matter of spouting consequence-free opinions. In fact, even casting a ballot in an election doesn't really have clear consequences, because you can't say for sure what any party is going to do. And when you have a situation where you can just say things without consequences, because no one's going to do anything based on it, there's no clear line between input and output, and this encourages irresponsibility. Some people inevitably figure out that they can get attention for saying outrageous things, even if it's negative attention. By contrast, direct participation has a clear goal. And when people spew out things even they don't take seriously, it's an annoyance to others and harmful to the reputation of the disruptive person. Which is why people on decision making platforms almost never engage in such behavior, even when there are no rules to prevent it. When people are trying to make an actual decision, the incentive to be disruptive is low and the punishment is high. When you're just shooting the breeze, it's the other way around. As we saw earlier, most of the heavy lifting of democracy is achieved by what you incentivize. If the incentive and the punishment is intrinsic to your system, it will do 90% of the work for you. Direct participation platforms are also more egalitarian. They generally do not allow companies or private associations to participate, just real individual people. And these people do not collect followers that can magnify their opinions. By contrast, our current communication, whether via social media or conventional media, is highly commercialized. Quite apart from advertisement and corporate accounts. Quite a few people work on politics there as part of their job, and they can label themselves in order to form cliques that attack people they don't like. These things are generally not possible on online democracy platforms, and this prevents what is in fact a very small proportion of behavior from poisoning the entire process. Online democracy definitely isn't click button impulse voting. There are strict procedures, and voting is generally preceded by a time for information and debate. But because this debate is continuous, rather than being crushed into a short period of time, it allows people to build up far more knowledge aimed at concrete problem solving. When you debate precise decisions rather than vague opinions or recommendations, you get to details and facts fast, because you have to. People tend to learn about these facts best over time rather than via a crash course, and in an environment where the interactions between policies can be clearly seen. This is more efficient than our current highly wasteful information systems are. Part of the reason people feel overwhelmed by information today is that so much of it is irrelevant and repetitive. Very rarely do you encounter an actual piece of information about anything, or a coherently put together article. Issues tend to be continuously relitigated, despite a lack of new information that would justify that. Focusing on solutions encourages people to think about how to present their information in a clear, concise, and relevant way, and it tends to privilege a more conscientious kind of person, rather than loudmouths who believe in the importance of their own opinion. If you digest just 10 to 15 minutes worth of actual information a day, this is more than enough to support decision making. There isn't a flood of information in the world today. There is a flood of noise. With online democracy, we can cut down on that noise dramatically and be better for it. As you can see, the important thing is that the process changes the incentives for how people interact with each other while still giving them real power. In fact, by giving them real power. We don't need to change people or to throw away democracy, because people just aren't good enough. In fact, people can work together extremely constructively in a process that respects humanity rather than denigrates it. We definitely haven't been overwhelmed by the internet, which has many positive uses. What is true is that we live in a society where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the very few rich never did have much of an interest in equality. It's no coincidence that in a time of great material inequality, we're seeing so many calls for political inequality as well. Oligarchs are merely trying to make the political world match the economic one that has been so beneficial to them, a world where they don't have to reason or negotiate with others on an equal basis, and where poor people aren't able to use the power of their numbers, the only thing they have, to have political impact. So thanks very much for taking part. I'll try to answer some of your questions in the Q&A. These are some of the sources that I used to compile this presentation, in case you want to look up any of them later to find out more. And of course, there's also more information in my 2 books, which are available on Amazon here.